It's noon on the West Coast, 3 o'clock at the White House, where the president is about to speak to reporters on an extraordinary news day. Here's what's happening. First, on world security. North Korea's dictator Kim Jong-un has now fired a ballistic missile for the first time in months. From the White House, the president was supposed to be meeting now with Republican and Democratic leaders, but after he attacked top Democrats on Twitter, they bailed. That could be an enormous problem, because when it comes to avoiding a potential government shutdown next week, the president may need more help than they need his. The Democrats trying to use their leverage on issues including health care and immigration.
Mr. President, we have a long to-do list before the end of the year, and time is running short.
Now we'll see how the president responds to that. He's also working on getting support for a tax cut bill with a visit to Capitol Hill today. But some lawmakers are not yet sold, and the polls show the American people are very much against it. We'll explain why on both fronts. Let's get to it.
Breaking news. Shepard Smith reporting live from the Fox News deck.
And what a day. This came out of nowhere. A live look at the White House, where the president is about to speak at any minute now. This was not scheduled. It was not on the agenda. At this moment, we were expecting to have a White House press briefing from Sarah Sanders, as is often the case around this time in the afternoon. Abruptly, just a short time ago, this was canceled. Instead, the president himself will speak on an extremely busy and consequential news day. We're waiting for reaction to North Korea launching yet another ballistic missile. Another challenge on what is already a make-or-break day for the president's agenda. President Trump is trying to cut deals on two separate fronts. First, with fellow Republicans on a tax plan. Then, with Democrats on a budget deal. Those talks hit a major setback over a presidential tweet. But let's begin today with the breaking news out of North Korea. A U.S. official confirms to Fox News that the North Koreans have test-fired another missile, the first in more than 2 months. We'll have the president when he speaks in just a moment, and here's what we know about how that's going to work. He's going to speak live to reporters in the Roosevelt Room. But the White House has said this will not be a live event. So the White House pool will shoot this event, will video this event, and then moments later it'll play out to all the television networks so that we can play it uninterrupted to you. We're expecting that moments from now. One other wrinkle. The White House pool is in the room, as I mentioned, and we'll be getting real-time readouts of what the president is saying. I'll have updates as they come in. But on North Korea, let's get to John Roberts, our chief White House correspondent who's live on the North Lawn. John, what do we know about this?
Shep, good afternoon, Tim. This is one of the things that the president, no question, will be addressing when the pool is moved into the Roosevelt Room. We're told that they're just holding in the upper press office right now, which is literally just across the hall from the Roosevelt Room. And I'll also point out to you that typically when we have presidential statements in the Roosevelt Room, they do them what's called live online, so that we can actually bring it to you live. But I would suspect that the meeting with the congressional leadership is probably now going to take place, and it's only the Republican leadership, in the Roosevelt Room, which means they've got the big table in there, which means that there probably isn't room for a camera to set up. So he'll do some quick remarks to the pool, though sometimes quick remarks can last as long as 35 minutes. I've been in those situations in the Oval Office. But I'm sure that the president's going to talk about North Korea. He'll also likely talk about tax reform, and I'm sure that he'll talk about the Democrats. But we can get to those other two issues. First of all, on North Korea, let's remember that during the president's recent trip to Asia, he was at every stop very diplomatic in his language, holding out, if not an olive branch, at least a potential opening to Kim Jong-un of North Korea to say, hey, listen, if you make some moves here, we're prepared to offer you, a better welcome into the League of Nations. Not the old League of Nations, of course, which became the UN, but, into the world community, if you give up your nuclear program. He convinced Xi Jinping of China to send an envoy to Pyongyang. It looks like that envoy went there and might not have met with much success because of that ballistic missile test. The president did, however, last week, in the early part of the week, put North Korea back on the list of state sponsors of terrorism, which is a very harsh diplomatic move and probably seen as North Korea as part of the provocation for this latest missile launch. So now, Shep, it looks like we're going back to this tit for tat, where the president says one thing, Kim Jong-un does another. I expect that the president will likely ratchet up the language against North Korea when he speaks in the Roosevelt Room in just a short time. I doubt if we'll hear the same diplomatic tone that he took when he was on that Asia trip. But no telling at this point whether or not he's got something in his back pocket to fire back at North Korea, or if he'll just up the rhetoric. Shep?
John, thanks very much. I want to talk to you in a moment, but we've just gotten some breaking news on this missile. Let's get to Jennifer Griffin, who's live at the Pentagon. Jennifer, what have you learned?
Shepard, a senior Pentagon official tells us they can confirm this was an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile fired by North Korea at about 3:17 a.m. local time. This is the first confirmation we've had from any U.S. official or from the South Koreans themselves. They were examining the trajectory of this missile, and now we understand that it was an ICBM. It's the first time that a missile has been fired since September 15th. October was the first month this year that no ballistic missiles were fired, but this is definitely a significant event, and the fact that it was an ICBM. Remember, North Korea has been working on the re-entry vehicle of that longer range missile. They can fly about 4,000 miles, and that puts Guam and Hawaii and other places in its trajectory. This missile, we understand from Japanese officials, landed in the waters off Japan in their what is known as their economic exclusion zone. That's about 200 plus miles off the coast of Japan. So we are hearing from U.S. defense officials that it flew for about 50 minutes. That would put it in the ICBM category. Typically, the Pentagon is the one to issue statements when it is an intercontinental ballistic missile. If it had been a shorter range missile, we would have expected that statement to come out of the U.S. Pacific Command in Hawaii.
For clarity, Jennifer, the difficult part for the North Koreans, in fact for everybody, about ICBMs is you can get it up out of the atmosphere, but then re-entry, there's an enormous amount of heat as it comes back into the atmosphere, and dealing with that heat without premature explosion or destruction of the missile itself, that's the difficult part. Will we have any clarity now on whether the North Koreans were able to accomplish that?
Well, I think we'll have to see. It's certainly unusual that they fired at 3 in the morning. Typically, these have been daytime launches, but with every launch, they are testing a new aspect of the program. And so what we will have to see from the scientists and from the analysis from the Pentagon, the intelligence estimates, is whether they have made another step forward. But I think it's slightly unusual for a missile to fly for 50 minutes and then land so close to the waters off to stay within the region. Typically, that missile might have gone, you would have expected it to have flown further away from North Korea, but clearly they're in the testing phase. It's also notable, Shep, that the South Koreans, within 6 minutes of the launch, the South Koreans launched their own precision strike to send a message to Pyongyang. Usually those are shorter range missile strikes with a trajectory that could reach Pyongyang to say, hey, you may have just launched, but we can reach you.
Over 50 minutes, it could have gone a long way, the suggestion being, as we've seen in the past, that they sent this missile on an upward trajectory and then allowed it to come straight back down for reasons that are clear. If you start going into other regions, the world's going to have a serious problem with you.
It's true, but it's mighty close to the shores of Japan. For it to fall into the economic exclusion zone, that is certainly worrisome, and we saw the statement from the Japanese Prime Minister's office in the middle of the night suggesting that this was very close to their shores.
Jennifer Griffin, stand by at the Pentagon. Back to John Roberts for the politics of this at the White House. John, the president had, as you mentioned, recently redesignated the North Koreans as state sponsors of terrorism. We know that people from China had gone over to try to ratchet or calm down this situation. It appears that neither of those tactics worked if your goal was to stop this sort of test.
No, and I was told by some experts on North Korea, Shep, prior to leaving for the Asia trip, that it may be that Kim Jong-un was looking for an off-ramp here, and the president seemed to agree with that idea, which is why the language we saw when he was in Japan and South Korea and even Vietnam was so diplomatic. But then designating North Korea as a state sponsor of terror clearly put a burr in the saddle of Kim Jong-un, which is why we might have seen this launch. And the arc of the launch, the trajectory of the launch, seems to follow what North Korea has done in the past, and that is you follow a parabolic curve as opposed to a typical intercontinental ballistic trajectory. You send the missile way, way, way up into the sky, into space, and then it comes back down not far from the launch. But if that were to take a traditional trajectory, it could probably reach as far as the United States, depending on how high it goes in the boost in the ascent phase. Hey, Shep, we should also point out, too, that the Senate Budget Committee, just on the other topic that we were talking about today, has approved on a partisan basis the tax reform plan, prompting reaction from Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the press secretary, who writes, quote, President Donald J. Trump applauds the Senate Budget Committee on taking an important step toward passing historic tax relief and reform and clearing the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act this afternoon. The momentum driving our shared priorities of job growth, economic competitiveness, and fiscal responsibility through tax reform is undeniable, and this administration is encouraged by the progress the Senate has made toward achieving these priorities. The President looks forward to providing tax cuts for hardworking Americans by the end of the year. The fact that this has passed the Budget Committee does not guarantee its passage in the Senate, though the President told Senator Ron Johnson, according to reports we have seen during this lunch, who was one of the holdout senators, don't vote against this bill, take up your differences with your colleagues and get this done. So it looks like Senator Johnson has indeed, as a member of the Budget Committee, voted yes on this bill. So we'll see where it goes from here. But, Shep, there's likely to be some substantial changes in this tax reform package before it hits the floor of the Senate for a vote, and that's what they'll be doing over the course of the next couple of days. The White House still optimistic that they may get a vote on this bill by Friday, if not Saturday, and we'll likely hear the President when he speaks to the pool in the Roosevelt Room, and that may be ongoing now. I haven't checked my email in the last minute because I got this new thing from Sarah Huckabee Sanders. That may be happening right now or about to happen, so we should get the playback from that sometime within the next 10 minutes, I would expect.
I think it's about to happen. As it turns out, Fox News happens to be, by matter of chance, it rotates, but we are the pool at this moment. And our producer, Fen Gomez, who is the pool producer for the day, he doesn't work for Fox News Channel for today. For today, he works for all of the networks, and he'll be reporting to all of us simultaneously. There's been no indication that that's begun yet, but certainly this will be among the topics. And it's interesting, John, because it's the Congressional Budget Office on which people on both sides of the aisle rely to score such matters. When it's for you, you call it nothing, and when it's with you, you call it the best. But the truth is, the CBO has said this will cut taxes for the wealthy over the period of the time that it applies. It will raise taxes on the working class. It makes tax cuts on corporations permanent. It does not on small businesses, and there are a lot of matters with which the House does not agree. In the matter of getting to budget reconciliation, although this is a bunch of inside jargon, getting this to where it does something to or for the people, depending on your perspective, is a long way down the road, at least legislatively.
It is. And when you look at the congressional budget estimates for the Senate tax bill, you're looking at $1.4 trillion added to the deficit over the next 10 years. The Senate has got a budget cap under reconciliation of $1.5 trillion. And people like Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, Senator Stephen Daines of Montana are saying, well, wait a minute here, there's a lot for corporations, as you point out, with a cut to 20%, which is permanent, but not as much for small businesses. And small businesses really are the drivers of job creation here in this country, though the President believes that by cutting corporate taxes, you're going to get a bigger boost for the economy. The House bill has got the small business taxes, the so-called pass-through S corporation, LLCs, at 25%. The Senate bill could actually see that number above 30%. So Ron Johnson and people like Daines are saying, wait a minute, we got to have more for small businesses here. But in order to do that, you might bust through the Senate budget cap of $1.5 trillion. So there's not a lot of wiggle room here. So over the course of the next couple of days, Shep, what you're going to see is some movement toward giving something toward small businesses that may not come in the form of an absolute tax cut, but some other measures as well. But again, with the CBO estimates, what they are, there's not a lot of room here. And then, of course, you're going to get people in high-tax states complaining about the House elimination of the local and state tax deductions, which may cause many people in the middle class to actually pay more taxes in those states. So there's a lot of debate and a lot of deal-making yet to be done before this thing sees the light of day in the Senate. And then, if it does pass the Senate, it's got to get reconciled with the House measure in the conference committee, and then it's got to go back to both the House and the Senate for a final vote before it gets to the President's desk. And it's likely that the House may side with the Senate bill more because they know that they'll have more problems getting it passed in the Senate than they will in the House.
They certainly will. John Roberts, stay with us. We're getting some breaking news from the Pentagon now. There's new information on the North Korean missile launch. Jennifer Griffin has it. Jennifer, to you.
Shepard, we have just confirmed with a senior U.S. defense official that this intercontinental ballistic missile fired by North Korea flew 2,800 miles into space. Remember, the U.S. space station is flying at about 250 miles outside of the Earth's atmosphere. 2,800 miles into space. It flew for 50 minutes, as we reported earlier, but that is why you saw it splash down so close to Japan, not far from the Korean Peninsula, because it was flying so long and so far into the Earth's atmosphere. 2,800 miles, we've just learned. This is only the third intercontinental ballistic missile test that the North Koreans have ever carried out. Two were carried out in July. That test in September flew over Japan, but it was not an ICBM. So this is certainly a game-changing moment in terms of the ballistic missile program of the North Koreans. Shepard.
Jennifer, thank you. The President's discussion from the Roosevelt Room has been pushed to 3:30. We're now 14 minutes away from that. John Roberts, after a day of political brinkmanship and gamesmanship, if you will, with the Democrats, Pelosi and Schumer saying, hey, if the President sent out a tweet, I don't see a deal coming. I'm going to meet with them, but I don't see a deal coming with them because they don't want to make a deal. Well, they took the next political step and said, if you don't see a deal, we won't meet with you. We'll meet with congressional Republicans. We'll try to work out a deal with them. Then Sarah Sanders was supposed to have the briefing that was to have begun 15 minutes ago. They nixed that and said, nope, we're sending out the messenger in chief. It is President Trump who said, if I want the message right, I'll send the message myself. When the day is big enough, when the topics are important enough, when he sees politics at a level where he's got to get out in front of it, that's what he does. And today he's doing that. He's taken a little bit more time today. And John, you have to wonder if he wasn't going to come out and talk about taxes with Schumer and Pelosi as our guide, and then this North Korea thing popped up. Now we know the missile went 2,800 miles into the sky, which is an astounding figure. You figure the President is going to have to address this, and what I wonder is he going to go harder, rhetorically speaking, with Kim Jong-un, or is he going to try to pacify things and let this calm down?
Well, again, Shep, when you look at a missile test and North Korea wanting the missile to land fairly close to its homeland, you know, if you were to take that 2,800-mile trajectory and put that into a typical intercontinental ballistic missile trajectory, it could go a lot further and potentially hit the middle part or even the east coast of the United States. I'm not sure exactly what the math is, but 2,800 miles, if memory serves me correctly, is higher than their last intercontinental ballistic missile test. So there are people that I've talked to who believe that you know, they are only a couple of developmental steps away from having something that could reach the United States with a re-entrable warhead. You mentioned the high heat associated with re-entry, and we've seen that, of course, with all of the launches of the space shuttle and all the Apollo program and all the other space tests and missions for NASA, where you get those incredible re-entry heats and you have the heat shield that protects against that. If North Korea has developed a weapon that can be fitted on the top of a intercontinental ballistic missile and they have the re-entry vehicle to send it back into the atmosphere, well, then that really means that we're at a step that is very close to the go, no-go in terms of what a U.S. response is going to be. So for this missile to go as high into space as it did, if you put that again into a traditional ICBM trajectory, that missile could go an awfully long way. And that may be the reason that we're seeing here for the delay in the President's remarks, that he may be coming up with some new statement based on this latest assessment by the Pentagon. We'll just have to wait and see, Shep.
John Roberts at the White House, Jennifer Griffin's at the Pentagon, our Mike Emanuel is on Capitol Hill, all standing by with stories which on their merits could be the lead story in half an hour's discussion and analysis on a given day. But today, we have enormous news. We have this new provocative action by the North Koreans showing for the world to see we're much closer to go, no go, to that position where North Korea would indeed be able to send an intercontinental ballistic missile with a nuclear weapon on the tip of it to hit U.S. properties and certainly many of our very close allies. In addition, there's a tax plan that's just gotten some approval in the Senate, but has a lot to do to get forward. It would be the first substantive accomplishment legislatively for this president, and to say it is crucial to his agenda is an understatement. Left out of our discussion in the first 19 minutes of this very busy news hour, the budget. If they don't come up with a budget, the government, in theory, will shut down. The last thing Republicans on Capitol Hill and the President of the United States seem to want Now, who to blame if that's where we go? And that's part of what is about to happen as the president addresses reporters and thus the nation from the Roosevelt Room just about 10 minutes from now. Our coverage continues on an exceedingly busy news day right after this. This is Fox News Channel, America's choice for news and information on cable. Less than 7 minutes now to the scheduled remarks from the President of the United States. Again, if you weren't with us earlier, just about an hour ago, the plan was for sort of a normal day for Sarah Sanders, I should say, to come to the microphone, deliver the regular press briefing, and then a political firestorm started to build in Washington. The president with a tweet, Nancy Pelosi and Senator Schumer with a "we're not going to meet with you." Then the president decides he's going to speak to reporters from the Roosevelt Room, and along the way we learned that the North Koreans have launched an intercontinental ballistic missile that went 2,800 miles into the sky before crashing into a zone around Japan. And now we wait to find out how the president will react to budget dealings, to tax plan, and to North Koreans, and we should learn that now in just about 5.5 minutes. In the meantime, the House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi and the Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, as I mentioned, pulled out of that Oval Office meeting that was set to take place, well, in the last 20 minutes. They called it a waste of time after President Trump tweeted this: meeting with Chuck and Nancy today about keeping government open and working. Problem is, they want illegal immigrants flooding into our country unchecked, are weak on crime, and want to substantially raise taxes. I don't see a deal. Well, some fact-checking is probably in order. They've said nothing about raising taxes. Not a word has been mentioned about that. What they say they want to do is come up with an agreement. Now, what it means politically is another matter. But here's how Senator Schumer responded to that. Listen.
President said, "I don't see a deal," 3 hours before our meeting, before he heard anything we had to say. Given that the president doesn't see a deal between Democrats and the White House, Leader Pelosi and I believe the best path forward is to continue negotiating with our Republican counterparts in Congress instead.
They're all trying to get a leg up on the other. That's apparently not happening either, because listen to what Speaker Ryan tweeted. "We have important work to do. There is a meeting at the White House this afternoon, and if Democrats want to reach an agreement on these issues, they will be there." Republicans need Democrats to pass a spending bill. They can't do it without the Democrats in this case. This isn't one of the things you can do all by yourself if you're Republicans. Since moving forward with the measure requires 60 votes in the U.S. Senate, that's the rule. The Republicans only have 52 seats. Even if they get all the Republicans, they're not even close. And some Democrats say they will not support a spending plan that doesn't protect the dreamers, the hundreds of thousands of immigrants whose parents brought them to the United States without documents. The president ended the program that gave them temporary legal status, remember, and he gave Congress until the month of March to come up with a permanent fix. But some GOP lawmakers say they do not want to include the dreamers in a spending bill that they have to pass next week by their own rules. Back to John Roberts, who's very busy and live for us on the North Lawn yet again. John?
Yeah, Shep, I mean, it was kind of surprising this morning that the president fired that preemptive tweet, if you will, and that Chuck Schumer, the Senate Minority Leader, said that the president should stop tweeting and start leading. But clearly he's tweaking the Democrats here. Remember that we had a number of months ago the president coming out and saying, hey, I've cut a deal with them in terms of what to do about the Dreamers in exchange for a budget resolution, the continuing resolution. But now it's getting down to short strokes in terms of that resolution is going to run out very soon, and they've got to get a budget deal going. So the Democrats clearly are not going to be cooperating. Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, said this afternoon that he has never not gone to a meeting that President Obama called, and he can't see why the Democrats are not going to this meeting. But there's a lot of thorny issues to work out here. You've got to have a budget. The president wants to do something about the Dreamers. He wants his measures on immigration, and he's meeting a lot of resistance from the Democrats on that, particularly on the issue of the wall. So we'll see where this meeting this afternoon goes, but if you're just talking to the Republicans about this, you're not going to get to the end point that you need to get to. And it's pretty clear that both sides have got their heels dug in a couple of issues. By the way, Shep, I just did a little rough calculation on that North Korean intercontinental ballistic missile. There was one that was fired back in May of this year, Hwasong-12, that went 1,320 miles through the atmosphere and into the lower parts of outer space. Well, this one went 2,800 miles. That Hwasong-12 could have reached parts of the continental United States. So this new missile going more than twice that far, Shep, that puts it right into the center of the heartland, which I think is really going to up the urgency here for the White House, for the Pentagon, for the National Security Council, and I think will dramatically affect what we hear from the President in the next few minutes.
And I'm guessing that was the reason for the delay, but we will know soon enough. John Roberts, thanks very much. Not very, very serious matter, this one. And we'll hear from the President on it, scheduled to begin in about a minute and a half. Meantime, Andrew Taylor's with us, congressional reporter for the Associated Press. He's been covering President Trump's lunch with GOP senators today. What do we know?
Well, for starters, we know that things are going pretty well for President Trump on his tax bill. He made some progress during the luncheon with a key moderate, Susan Collins. Things seem to be going better with Bob Corker, who he's been at odds with.
What's making things better? What's changed that now they're on board?
Well, for instance, Susan Collins told reporters after lunch that she's been asking to get these cost-sharing payments done because if you get rid of the individual mandate, it may blow up the health insurance markets. She's gotten an okay on that. She actually said she's got a promise that that would be signed into law before she'd have to cast a final vote on the House-Senate compromise on taxes. So she's sounding very much like she wants to vote yes. Senator Corker just voted yes in the Budget Committee. That's kind of a ministerial function, but he still says he's getting progress on this mechanism that would be sort of a fail-safe in case the revenues don't come in as expected. So that was good news on the tax front. On the budget front, as you've been saying, things have blown up. Things seem to be completely up in the air. They're sort of in a bad phase right now, and then we'll see whether they can put Humpty Dumpty back together again.
And that putting Humpty Dumpty back together again, to borrow your analysis, that's the hard part.
Yes, well, I think what they need to do is they want to get an overall agreement on how much money to give the Pentagon and how much money to give domestic programs. Once you do that, you can set in motion a bigger negotiation that would take in things such as the Dreamers and a variety of other issues that are still even trickier to figure out.
And then once you start putting things together with the other side of the hill, what are the biggest? I know there are two major differences in the two plans. Ones that you don't just say, okay, we can resolve those. It's much more complicated than that, is it not?
Well, if you're talking about taxes, there are some key differences, but as far as taking care of state and local deductions. On the spending front, this whole Dreamer issue is, and as well as the U.S.-Mexico border wall, those are issues that can only be solved by Trump cutting a deal with Democrats.
Andrew Taylor's the congressional reporter for the Associated Press on a very busy day. Andrew, thank you. We're now waiting for the President to begin. The indication is he's just taking just a few more minutes. He has not begun speaking yet in the Roosevelt Room. So when we expect that in just a moment he will, and remember how this works, the President speaks, he finishes speaking, then the White House pool plays the tape back for us so you can all hear it. But along the way, we're going to find out in real time what he's saying about the budget, about taxes, and specifically now with the brand new and breaking news on North Korea. It is an exceedingly busy afternoon, and it continues after this. The President has not yet begun speaking in the Roosevelt Room to reporters who are gathered for what has turned out to be an impromptu delivery of information to reporters and then to you. We're expected to hear much more on the North Korean missile launch that happened today. Plus, the Senate Budget Committee voted along party lines to send a Republican tax bill to the full Senate for a vote. The Senate is expected to begin debating that tax bill and vote on it sometime this week. The House of Representatives has already passed its version of a package of tax cuts. The news continues with President Trump from the White House and much more from Capitol Hill as lawmakers continue to jockey for position on this matter. In addition, John Roberts at the White House. We're expecting new information from him on political reaction to the moves on the part of the North Koreans. You heard him report just minutes ago that this missile, in theory, could have reached the heartland of America. More news next. Waiting for the President to speak in the Roosevelt Room, and I was just looking down to see if he has begun, and it's clear that he has not yet. This has been delayed for the better part of a half hour or so as we wait to see what the president will say on North Korea. In the meantime, there's a lot to be said about the tax bill, which is winding its way on a bumpy route through Congress. Our chief congressional correspondent, Mike Emanuel, is live up on Capitol Hill. What are you hearing from GOP leaders at this stage, Mike?
Well, Shep, that they don't have the votes just yet. They need 50 Republican senators to say yes to tax reform. They're working to get there. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said after the luncheon today that they are trying to address the concerns, trying to make sure they have 50 members who are satisfied. One bright spot for GOP leaders today was, of course, in the Budget Committee hearing where some members who were maybe not on tax reform voted yes to advance the bill. They are Ron Johnson, who had serious concerns about whether corporations were being rewarded more than small businesses in terms of this tax reform package. You also had Bob Corker, who has had his run-ins with President Trump. He's had concerns about the debt, and so they're trying to address those concerns, trying to get 50 to yes, Shep.
Mike Emanuel on the Hill, thanks. We're getting new information from Jennifer Griffin, who's live at the Pentagon with more on this North Korean missile launch. This calculation by John Roberts in his reporting from the White House that it appears, given the information that we received, that this missile could theoretically have hit the heartland of America. That's an eye-opener.
Well, in fact, Shepard, we've been speaking to ballistic missile experts, and they say that, in fact, based on the 50-minute flying time and the 2,800 miles that it flew up into space, that puts every city in the United States, including the East Coast, in the trajectory of this potential North Korean intercontinental ballistic missile. So this puts the entire mainland United States within range of North Korea's ballistic missile program. That is a dramatic change from the past. Just to put in perspective how high 2,800 miles into space is, that is more than 10 times higher than where the International Space Station orbits around the Earth. This missile flew quite some time and quite high into the atmosphere. As we've said in the past, they are trying to perfect the re-entry aspect of the ICBM program. We still don't know the condition of the missile when it landed in those waters off of Japan, but that re-entry is going to be the key to them taking the next step forward. I think it's also notable that earlier today, the South Korean unification minister warned that North Korea's nuclear program is advancing more quickly than many had thought. He said, quote, experts think North Korea will take 2 to 3 more years, but they are developing their nuclear capabilities faster than expected, and we cannot rule out the possibility Pyongyang may declare the completion of their nuclear program in a year. That is a strong statement from South Korea earlier today. The South Koreans, within 6 minutes of this North Korean launch, fired their own missiles to send a message to Pyongyang. Shep.
Thanks very much, Jennifer Griffin. Let's get some context now. Michael O'Hanlon, Brookings Institution, a senior fellow with us and live with us from there. Michael, a lot of developments today on this situation with North Korea. I'd be interested to hear your observations.
Hi, Shepard. Well, certainly everything that's been reported is concerning. It is worth remembering a few things to put this whole thing in some context. First of all, if we were ever in a war with North Korea, we're not going to watch them fuel up an ICBM on the launch pad and just wonder if it might happen to accurately strike a U.S. city. We're going to try to destroy it before it's even launched. Right now, as best I understand, and I think U.S. intelligence understands, North Korean long-range missiles are liquid-fueled, which means they have to be located at a launch site and prepared for launch over a period of perhaps an hour, during which time we would be watching, at least in wartime and generally in peacetime as well. And that's not a blanket guarantee that we would be able to preempt, but it is one more option. As you know, we have a missile defense system in Alaska and California, imperfect reliability, but we do have some 40 interceptors, and if North Korea only has a couple of ICBMs, we've got a chance to shoot the thing down there as well. So North Korea has to know this would be suicidal, even in the case that they succeed. So I don't think Americans should necessarily go home today more anxious about the likelihood of a bolt from the blue. But you and I also are aware that this is a dynamic crisis in which the United States is now going to have to think about response. And North Korea knew that in advance. So we have to wonder what's their game. It may just be to try to complete this missile program before China really cracks down on them with economic sanctions. Or they may be trying to keep the pressure on China to say, you know what, don't squeeze us too hard because we're half crazy. And if you squeeze us hard, we can do some things that you won't like in response. So trying to play the game of both perfecting their missile capability, but also keeping Beijing on edge, that the tighter and tougher the sanctions get, it doesn't necessarily make North Korea cry uncle. So these are the various messages I'm drawing out of today's launch.
The White House pool, the camera people, the producers have just been brought into the Roosevelt room. We presume the president is about to start speaking. If you're advising the president today, Michael, on what sort of rhetorical flourishes that are appropriate here or might be helpful for the United States, what do you tell him?
Well, I think, first of all, the message of Secretary Mattis has been very good, which is very firm but calm, and reminding North Korea what they hopefully already know, which is that obviously if they ever dared launch one of these things at us, it would be the end of their regime. But I think it's also important in policy terms, while we're trying to get China to put more economic pressure on North Korea, I think we need a more realistic negotiating strategy. North Korea is not going to give up its bomb tomorrow. China's not going to put enough pressure on for that to happen. So I think we need some kind of an interim deal, some kind of a freeze that's a very tough freeze, but nonetheless one that aspires to denuclearization only in the longer term, not in the first negotiation. Otherwise, I think China is just going to do enough to keep President Trump off their back, so to speak, put a little more pressure on North Korea, but this thing is going to keep going, and North Korea is going to keep developing its nukes and its missiles.
Thanks very much, Michael O'Hanlon from Brookings. It's nice to talk to you.
Thank you, Shepard.
The president, again, the White House pool has been brought in for the president's remarks to the nation, to the reporters there, and to the nation, of course. We need to get in a quick commercial break so that we don't miss any of that. We'll bring it to you uninterrupted right after this.